We just recently finished our first therapy session. We didn't get...
Welcome back to my channel. What you're about to hear isn't just another chapter in the chaos of sister wives. This is the moment everything finally broke. The kind of moment that doesn't just damage a family, it ends it. Because when a family loses a child, something sacred is supposed to happen. Grief, as unbearable as it is meant to pull people closer. It's supposed to strip away ego, pride, and resentment, leaving only love behind. But for Kody Brown, insiders are saying the exact opposite happened. Instead of unity, there was division. Instead of comfort, there was distance. And instead of a father stepping up for his grieving children, there was a man who, according to sources, made one of the most painful days of their lives even worse. At Garrison Brown's memorial, emotions were already raw beyond words. This wasn't just a loss, it was a complicated, unresolved tragedy. A son gone too soon, and a relationship with his father that never had the chance to heal. That alone is enough to shatter any parent. But what's being whispered behind the scenes is what truly stunned the family. Sources claim Kody's behavior during those services didn't reflect a man humbled by loss. It reflected someone consumed by his own presence. There are quiet but powerful allegations that he turned moments meant for collective mourning into something that felt uncomfortably centered around himself. Not intentionally loud, not dramatically obvious, but subtle enough and painful enough that his children noticed. Imagine being one of those kids, standing there, grieving your brother, trying to process a loss that doesn't even feel real yet, and then feeling like your pain isn't being seen. That's the part that cuts the deepest. Because according to insiders, it wasn't just what Kody did, it was how it made his children feel. Invisible. Secondary. Like their grief had to compete with his. And for a family that had already endured years of emotional fractures, favoritism, and strained relationships, this wasn't just another disappointment. This was the breaking point. The moment where whatever fragile thread was still holding things together finally snapped. And the fallout? It didn't take months. It didn't even take weeks. It happened almost instantly. Because after that memorial, something shifted in a way that may never be repaired. We're not talking about minor disagreements or temporary distance. We're talking about children making the kind of decisions that no parent ever wants to face. Decisions that say, I'm done. Publicly. Permanently. And the clearest, most heartbreaking proof came from two of Kody's own children, Kody Brown and Mykelti Brown. Both of them, in their own ways, confirmed something that sent shockwaves through fans and followers. They haven't seen their father since their brother's funeral. Let that sink in. The last time they stood in the same space as the man who raised them was the day they buried their brother. And whatever happened during that time was powerful enough, painful enough, that they walked away and never looked back. This isn't silence. This isn't distance caused by time or busy lives. This is a line drawn in emotional stone. What makes Mykelti's situation even more devastating is that she wasn't completely estranged before this. She was one of the few still trying. One of the few still hoping. Still believing that maybe, somehow, her father could change. That maybe the years of hurt, the favoritism, the emotional disconnect, maybe all of that could still be repaired. But according to what's unfolding now, that hope didn't survive the memorial. Whatever she witnessed, whatever she felt in that moment, it was enough to end that effort completely. And this is where the tragedy deepens beyond just loss. Because these kids aren't just grieving a brother. They're grieving a father who is still alive. They're processing two losses at the same time, one permanent, one chosen. And that kind of emotional weight? It doesn't just fade. It reshapes everything. Relationships. Identity. Trust. The way they see family itself. And the most haunting part is this. It didn't have to happen this way. All Kody had to do was be present. Truly present. Not as a personality. Not as a figure. But as a father. And according to everything coming out now, that's exactly what he failed to be. But if you think the story ends with quiet distance and unspoken pain, it doesn't. Because what happened next was louder, rawer, and far more devastating. This wasn't just about stepping away anymore. This was about rejection in its most public and painful form. And it came directly from Kody Brown. In a moment that stunned viewers and followers alike, Kody took to social media and did something almost unthinkable for a son to do. He didn't just express disappointment. He didn't just hint at tension. He openly begged people, strangers, to stop comparing him to his own father, Kody Brown. Think about the emotional weight behind that. This wasn't said casually. This wasn't frustration slipping out in a heated moment. This was deliberate, intentional, a line drawn in front of the entire world. And the most chilling part? He didn't even refer to Kody as my dad or my father. He called him that guy. 2 words. But those 2 words carried years of pain, resentment, and emotional distance. Because when a child reaches the point where they can no longer even associate their identity with their parent, something has gone deeply, irreparably wrong. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't immaturity. Kody is a grown man who has lived through the evolution and the breakdown of this family in real time. He's watched the dynamics shift, the relationships fracture, the favoritism become impossible to ignore. He's seen how his father treated his mothers, how decisions were made, how certain children were prioritized while others were left emotionally sidelined. And now, after everything, after the years of tension and the final blow of what happened at Garrison Brown's memorial, he made it clear that he wants no part of that legacy. And here's what makes this moment even more heartbreaking. When someone publicly distances themselves from a parent like that, it's not just anger speaking, it's self-preservation. It's someone saying, I've seen enough. I know where this leads. And I refuse to become it. Sources close to the situation suggest that Kody isn't trying to be cruel or dramatic. He's trying to protect his mental health, his future, and the kind of man he wants to be. Because in his eyes, staying connected to Kody doesn't just risk emotional pain, it risks becoming part of a pattern he no longer believes in. And yet, despite how loud and clear this rejection was, despite how deeply it should have shaken any parent to their core, there's a growing sense that Kody still doesn't fully grasp what's happening. Because while his son is publicly drawing boundaries and distancing himself in the most definitive way possible, Kody continues to move forward as if the damage isn't permanent. As if these are just temporary reactions. As if time will somehow fix what accountability never addressed. But what Kody did wasn't temporary. It wasn't emotional noise. It was a final statement. And whether Kody realizes it or not, that statement may be one of the clearest signs yet that this family fracture has gone beyond repair. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get more surreal, more emotionally confusing, or more painfully contradictory, Kody Brown stepped onto a completely different stage, one that should have been his moment of redemption. A moment where, for once, the world might finally see accountability. That moment came during his appearance on Special Forces, World's Toughest Test. Stripped of the usual family dynamics, placed under pressure, and confronted by authoritative figures who weren't part of his world, Kody was pushed into a situation where he couldn't deflect, couldn't dominate the narrative, and couldn't rely on the usual patterns that had defined him for years. And for a brief moment, it looked like something real was happening. During an intense interrogation sequence, Kody broke down. Not subtly. Not performatively, at least. Not on the surface. He cried. He admitted failure. He said words that many of his children had likely waited years to hear. He acknowledged that he hadn't been a good father. That he misunderstood what it meant to lead a family. That his relationships with his children were broken, not because of them, but because of him. And for viewers watching at home, it felt like a breakthrough. The kind of emotional collapse that signals transformation, growth, change. The kind of moment where you think, maybe this is it. Maybe now he finally gets it. But here's where everything starts to unravel again. Because while the tears were real, or at least convincing, the context surrounding them raised serious questions. This wasn't a private conversation with his children. This wasn't a quiet attempt to repair relationships behind the scenes. This was happening on national television, in front of cameras, in a controlled environment designed for emotional exposure. And the most telling detail of all? His children didn't even know he was going on the show. Think about that for a second. A man who is supposedly realizing his failures as a father, who is openly admitting that he's hurt his children, decides to go on a televised program to process those feelings, without telling the very people he's claiming to want to reconnect with. No warning. No conversation. No effort to prepare them for what they were about to see. If this was truly about healing, wouldn't the first step have been reaching out to them directly? Instead, they were left to watch, just like everyone else, as their father delivered a version of accountability they had never personally received. And that's where the skepticism begins to grow. Because this isn't the first time Kody has appeared emotional on camera. It's not the first time he's said the right words in the right setting. Over the years on Sister Wives, viewers have seen glimpses of vulnerability before, moments that felt like turning points, only for old patterns to resurface again and again. So the question becomes impossible to ignore. Was this real change, or just another perfectly timed performance? Even more troubling is the timing itself. This breakdown didn't happen before the damage. It didn't happen when relationships were still salvageable. It came after Garrison Brown's death. After the memorial. After children like Kody and Mykelti had already distanced themselves. After the fracture had already widened into something far more permanent. Which raises an even heavier question. Was this moment of accountability driven by genuine reflection, or was it shaped by the consequences he could no longer ignore? Because real change isn't proven in what someone says under pressure. It's proven in what they do when the cameras are gone. And as we're about to see, that's where Kody's story begins to fall apart all over again. And when that episode finally aired, when the world watched Kody Brown break down and seemingly take responsibility for years of damage, there was one reaction that mattered more than anyone else's, his daughter's. Because for Mykelti Brown, this wasn't just reality TV. This wasn't just another episode to analyze or react to. This was deeply personal. This was her father, saying things she had waited her entire life to hear, but saying them somewhere else, to someone else, instead of to her. And when she sat down to watch that moment, what unfolded wasn't clarity, it was emotional conflict. During her watch-along, Mykelti didn't come across as angry or dismissive. Instead, she seemed torn. She admitted that the scene made her emotional, that she had even rewatched it multiple times, trying to process what she was feeling. And that right there says everything. Because when a daughter has to replay her father's apology over and over again just to understand whether it's real, that's not healing, that's confusion layered on top of years of hurt. She openly said that part of her appreciated what he said. That hearing him take accountability felt refreshing. But even in that moment, there was hesitation, doubt, a quiet question lingering beneath every word, why now, and why like this? Because here's the heartbreaking truth. This was the first time Mykelti had ever heard her father admit these things. Not in a conversation. Not in a phone call. Not in a private moment between father and daughter. But on a television show in front of strangers under pressure. That realization alone carries a kind of pain that's hard to put into words. Imagine needing validation, accountability, acknowledgement from someone your entire life, and finally getting it, but not directly. Not personally. Almost like you weren't the intended audience. And yet, despite all of that, Mykelti didn't completely shut the door. That's what makes her position so emotionally complex. She didn't reject what he said outright. She didn't call it fake or meaningless. Instead, she held space for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, something had shifted. But at the same time, she wasn't ready to trust it. Because history has a way of repeating itself, especially when patterns go unbroken. And Mykelti knows those patterns better than anyone. She's lived them. She's seen moments of vulnerability come and go, only to be followed by the same behavior that caused the damage in the first place. Her community picked up on that tension immediately. The comments, the questions, they all circled around one central concern. Has he actually changed? Not just in words. Not just in emotional moments captured on camera, but in real life. In the quiet, everyday choices that define who someone truly is. And even Mykelti didn't seem to have a clear answer. Because while her husband Tony mentioned that Kody had reached out to her after filming, even that detail came with uncertainty. The connection wasn't fully restored. The relationship wasn't suddenly healed. It was described as pending, a word that feels less like progress and more like hesitation. And maybe that's the most telling part of all. Because if this moment on Special Forces was truly a turning point, if it represented genuine transformation, then the impact should have been immediate and undeniable. It should have reached all of his children, not just one. It should have sparked conversations, reconnections, healing. But instead, what we're seeing is something far more fragmented. One daughter trying to believe, others still completely distant, and a father whose words may have sounded powerful, but whose actions are still being quietly questioned. And this is where the illusion of change begins to completely fall apart. Because if Kody Brown's emotional breakdown on Special Forces, World's Toughest Test, was truly a turning point, if those tears meant anything beyond the moment, then the next steps should have been obvious. Real change doesn't pick and choose. Real accountability doesn't take the easy path. It doesn't reach out only where it feels safe. It goes directly to the places that hurt the most. The relationships that are the most broken. The children who need it the most. But that's not what happened. Not even close. Instead, what we're seeing is something painfully familiar. A pattern that has followed Kody for years: selective effort, selective connection, selective accountability. Yes, he reached out to Mykelti Brown, and that's important. But let's be honest about what that really means. Mykelti was already one of the few children still open to communication. She was already the bridge that hadn't fully burned. Reaching out to her wasn't the hardest step, it was the easiest one. The lowest risk. The safest option in a situation where rejection was almost guaranteed elsewhere. But what about Kody Brown? The same son who publicly distanced himself in the most definitive way possible. The one who made it clear that he didn't even want to be associated with his father anymore. Where was the effort there? Where was the attempt to repair that damage? Silence. Complete silence. And that silence speaks louder than any apology ever could. Because when someone claims they've changed, but avoids the very relationships that require the most work, it raises a difficult, but necessary question: who is this change really for? And it doesn't stop there. Other siblings who reportedly pulled away after Garrison Brown's memorial are still maintaining that distance. No sudden reconnections. No visible attempts to rebuild what was lost. Just the same emotional gaps that existed before, now even wider. And yet, from the outside, it might still look like progress because there's some contact happening. But partial effort isn't transformation. It's repetition. It's the same pattern, just presented in a slightly different way. What makes this even more frustrating and, honestly, heartbreaking is how predictable it all feels. Because this is exactly how these dynamics have played out in the past. Kody gravitates toward the relationships that require less accountability, less humility, less discomfort. He invests where he feels accepted and withdraws where he feels challenged. And while that might protect his ego in the short term, it continues to damage the very relationships that need healing the most. Even within Mykelti's own response, there are hints of this reality. The fact that her relationship with her father is described as pending isn't a sign of resolution, it's a sign of uncertainty. It means the door isn't closed, but it's not fully open either. It means trust hasn't been rebuilt. It means that even after everything he said on national television, even after acknowledging his failures, the people closest to him are still waiting to see if his actions will match his words. And maybe that's the most revealing part of all. Because true change doesn't need to be questioned this much. It doesn't leave people guessing. It doesn't create situations where children have to analyze, debate, and emotionally process whether their parents' apology is real. It shows itself clearly, consistently, and across every relationship, not just the convenient ones. But so far, what we're seeing from Kody isn't consistency. It's fragmentation. It's effort in one direction and absence in another. And until that changes, everything he said on that show risks becoming just another moment that sounded powerful, but ultimately meant very little. And just when you think the contradictions couldn't get any more glaring, another moment surfaces that makes everything even harder to ignore. Because while Kody Brown was publicly breaking down on special forces, world's toughest test, talking about regret, failure, and missed opportunities as a father, something real was happening in his family. Something joyful. Something meaningful. Something that should have been impossible for any parent to overlook. His daughter, Maddie Brown Brush, had just welcomed a new baby into the world. Now pause there for a second. Because this is where the story shifts from emotional confusion to something far more difficult to defend. A daughter who had already been distant from her father for years experiences one of the most life-changing moments a person can have: the birth of a child. A moment filled with hope, with new beginnings, with the kind of joy that has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. And in that exact window of time, while claiming to reflect on his failures as a parent, Kody reportedly didn't reach out at all. No message. No call. Not even a simple acknowledgement. Let that reality settle in. Because this wasn't just a missed opportunity, this was the opportunity. The kind of moment that could have opened a door that had been closed for years. According to what's been shared within the family, it had already been 2 or 3 years since Maddie had spoken to her father. That distance didn't happen overnight. It was built over time, shaped by disappointment, unresolved issues, and emotional disconnect. But moments like this, the birth of a child, they create openings. They soften boundaries. They offer a chance, however small, to say, "I'm still here. I still care." And instead, there was silence. And what makes this even more painful is the contrast between what Kody was saying and what he was doing. On one hand, he's on television, admitting that he failed his children, that he should have been better, that he regrets the state of his relationships. But on the other hand, when faced with a real-life moment to demonstrate change, not with words, not with emotion, but with a simple action, he does nothing. And that gap between words and actions? That's where trust breaks down completely. Meanwhile, Maddie named her baby Amelia Estelle, with the middle name chosen in honor of Garrison Brown. Think about the emotional weight of that. She's celebrating new life while carrying the memory of loss. She's honoring her brother while stepping into motherhood again. It's a moment layered with both joy and grief, something only a family can truly understand together. And yet, the one person who should have been present in that emotional space wasn't. This wasn't about being busy. It wasn't about not knowing. In today's world, information travels fast, especially within families. If he wanted to know, he could have known. If he wanted to reach out, he could have. Which leaves only one conclusion that's hard to accept but impossible to ignore. It was a choice. A conscious decision not to engage. Not to bridge the gap. Not to step into a moment that required humility, vulnerability, and effort. And this is where the narrative of change starts to feel less like a reality and more like a contradiction. Because growth isn't measured by what someone says when they're under pressure. It's measured by what they do when no one is watching. And in this case, when faced with a moment that could have meant everything, Kody chose absence. And for a family already carrying so much distance, that absence didn't just go unnoticed, it reinforced everything they've been feeling all along. And if there's one pattern that continues to expose just how deep the dysfunction really runs, it's the way Kody Brown talks about his children as if they're all the same. Not individuals. Not unique relationships with different histories, different wounds, and different needs, but one collective group. One blurred-out version of my kids. And on the surface, that might sound harmless. It might even sound protective. But according to Mykelti Brown, it's anything but. Because what he calls protection actually looks a lot like avoidance. During her reflections, Mykelti pointed out something that reveals more than Kody probably intended. She believes he groups all of his children together so he doesn't have to single anyone out, so no one feels targeted or exposed. But here's the problem with that logic. When you refuse to acknowledge individual pain, you also refuse to take responsibility for it. Because every single one of his children has experienced their relationship with him differently. Some felt ignored. Some felt replaced. Some felt manipulated. Some were caught in the middle of conflicts that had nothing to do with them. These aren't shared experiences, they're deeply personal ones. And they don't get resolved with a one-size-fits-all apology. This lumping together approach allows Kody to stay in a space where accountability is vague, general, non-specific. He can say things like, "I failed my kids," without ever having to sit down and say, "This is how I failed you." And that difference matters more than anything, because real healing doesn't happen in generalizations. It happens in specifics. It happens when someone is willing to look directly at the damage they caused and take ownership of it, not as a concept, but as a lived reality for another person. And this is exactly why Mykelti has expressed frustration with that pattern. Because from her perspective, it shows that even now, even after everything, the breakdowns, the distance, the public conversations, he still isn't doing the deeper work. The harder work. The work that requires him to step out of his comfort zone and into uncomfortable, honest conversations with each of his children. Conversations where he can't hide behind broad statements or emotional speeches. Conversations where he has to listen, not lead. Acknowledge, not defend. What makes this even more revealing is how this pattern connects directly to everything we've already seen. The selective outreach. The silence towards certain children. The effort given to some relationships while others are left untouched. It all ties back to the same core issue, a reluctance to engage on an individual level when that level requires accountability. Because it's easier to say, "I love all my kids," than it is to prove it in ways that are meaningful to each one of them. And the truth is, every child in this family is at a different place. Kody Brown has drawn a clear line. Mykelti is somewhere in the middle, open but cautious. Maddie Brown Brush has maintained distance for years. Others have stepped back quietly without public statements. Each relationship is its own story, its own wound, its own possibility or impossibility of repair. But Kody's approach treats them all as if they can be addressed the same way, with the same effort at the same time. And that's where the real damage continues. Because when you fail to see people as individuals, especially your own children, you fail to meet them where they are. You fail to understand what they need. And most importantly, you fail to give them a reason to believe that anything has actually changed. So while Kody may believe he's protecting his family by speaking broadly, what he's actually doing is reinforcing the very distance he claims he wants to fix. And until that changes, every apology, every emotional moment, every claim of growth will continue to feel incomplete. And in the middle of all this emotional wreckage, the distance, the silence, the fractured relationships, there's one piece of the puzzle that makes everything even more complicated. Because not every child has walked away. Not every voice has joined the chorus of rejection. In fact, one of Kody Brown's children has done the exact opposite, and it's creating a tension that runs just as deep as the estrangement itself. That child is Logan Brown. Unlike some of his siblings, Logan hasn't publicly distanced himself in dramatic or emotional ways. He hasn't taken to social media to reject his father or draw hard lines in front of the world. Instead, what he's done is quieter, but just as powerful. He's shown support. Publicly. Subtly, but clearly. Commenting on posts related to special forces, world's toughest test, offering encouragement, and, in doing so, giving Kody something that very few others are right now, validation. And for someone like Kody, that kind of validation isn't small. It's everything. Because when most of your children are either silent or distant, even a single voice of support can feel like proof that things aren't as broken as they seem. It becomes something to hold on to, something to point at, something that allows you to say, "See? Not all of my kids have turned away." But here's where it gets complicated. Because while Logan's support may come from a genuine place, from his own perspective, his own experience, his own relationship with his father, it doesn't erase what the other children are feeling. And it doesn't fix what's been broken. In fact, it can unintentionally deepen the divide. Because while Logan is publicly supporting their father, Kody Brown is publicly rejecting him. While Logan is offering encouragement, Mykelti Brown is trying to process confusion and uncertainty. While Logan is maintaining a connection, Maddie Brown Brush remains distant, having gone years without contact. These aren't just different reactions, they're completely different realities. And trying to hold all of them together at the same time? That creates emotional tension that no family is prepared to handle. What makes Logan's role in this even more significant is his history. He's always been seen as one of the more grounded, private members of the family. Someone who stayed out of the spotlight when possible. Someone who didn't feed into the drama. So when he does speak, even in small ways, it carries weight. It gives Kody a sense of legitimacy, a sense that not everything is lost. But at the same time, it risks giving him something else too, an excuse. An emotional escape route from the harder truths he still needs to face. Because as long as there is one relationship that feels intact, it becomes easier to avoid the ones that are broken. As long as there is one child offering support, it becomes easier to downplay the voices that are expressing pain. And that's the danger here. Not Logan's support itself, but how it might be used. Because instead of serving as a bridge to reconnect with the rest of his children, it could become a shield. A way to protect himself from fully confronting the depth of the damage that's been done. And for the siblings watching this dynamic unfold, it's not just about their father anymore, it's about each other. Because when one sibling supports a parent that others feel hurt by, it doesn't just create distance between parent and child, it creates distance between siblings too. It introduces questions, tension, unspoken disagreements that can quietly fracture those relationships as well. And in a family already dealing with grief, loss, and emotional separation, that added layer of complexity only makes healing that much harder. And when you step back and look at everything together, the distance, the silence, the public rejection, the selective effort, the missed opportunities, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Kody Brown isn't just a father who lost a son, he's a father who is actively losing the rest of his children too. And what makes that realization so chilling is how preventable it all was. Because after the death of Garrison Brown, there was a moment, a brief, fragile window, where everything could have shifted. A moment where grief could have brought this family back together. Where pain could have turned into perspective. Where a father could have looked at his remaining children and realized just how precious, how fragile, how temporary these relationships truly are. But instead of that moment becoming a turning point, it became the final breaking point. Instead of pulling his children closer, Kody's actions, or lack of them, pushed them further away. And that's the part that's hardest to understand. Because any parent who has just experienced that kind of loss would be expected to hold on tighter, to reach out more, to fight for every connection that still exists. But here, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing distance grow, silence deepen. Relationships fade not because they had to, but because they weren't nurtured when it mattered most. And maybe the most unsettling part of all this isn't just what's happened, it's how Kody seems to be responding to it. Because while his children are grieving, not just their brother, but the state of their family, he continues to operate as if the damage isn't final. As if time alone will fix what effort never addressed. As if apologies made on television can somehow replace conversations that never happened in real life. But relationships don't heal through distance. They don't repair themselves in silence. They require presence, consistency, humility, and above all, action. Because right now, the evidence tells a very different story. A son like Kody Brown has made it clear he wants no association. A daughter like Mykelti Brown is still questioning whether change is real. Another daughter like Maddie Brown Brush remains distant during some of the most important moments of her life. And even with one child like Logan Brown showing support, it doesn't erase the reality that the majority of these relationships are still fractured, still unresolved, still waiting for something that hasn't fully come. And that brings us to the question that lingers over all of this, the one that doesn't have an easy answer. Can a father come back from this? Can someone rebuild trust after failing their children during the darkest moment of their lives? Because it's one thing to make mistakes over time. It's one thing to slowly damage relationships through years of conflict and misunderstanding. But it's something entirely different to fall short when your family needs you the most. When the stakes are at their highest. When the moment demands everything you have, and you still don't show up the way you should. That kind of failure doesn't just hurt, it defines everything that comes after. And unless something truly changes, not just in words, but in actions, this story may not be about reconciliation at all. It may be about consequences. About what happens when patterns go unbroken for too long. about what it means to lose not just one child, but the trust of the ones who are still here. So what do you think? After everything that's happened, after everything we've seen, is there still a path back for Kody? Or has that door already closed for good? Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe, because this story isn't over yet.